Welcome and thank you so much for listening to the Civic Space today with Southern Defenders, a program that shines a light on human rights issues that impact on the Southern Africa region. My name is Mandata Mlojwa and I am your host for today's show. In this episode, we are unpacking the 2023 Freedom in the World report published by Freedom House. While the core focus today is on the Southern Africa region, we will also highlight the placing of the region's freedom status to the broader continent and the world at large. Joining me today to shed a light on the report is Tiseke Kasambala, who brings both experience and expertise to the conversation. Tiseke Kasambala is the Director for Africa Programs at Freedom House. She has 20 years of experience working in East and Southern Africa on human rights, democracy, and governance. Before joining Freedom House, Tiseke was the Deputy Executive Director and Head of Programs at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, OSISA. And prior to that, she worked at Human Rights Watch in various leadership positions, including as Southern Africa Director and the Africa Advocacy Director. She's a published author and her opinion pieces have appeared in numerous local, regional, and international news outlets. She holds a master's degree in social sciences from the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I could go on. All I can say is she's an amazing person. Tiseke, thank you so much and welcome to today's episode.
Thank you so much, Mantate, to you and Southern Defenders for having me. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure. So I'll just jump straight into the conversation. I want us to warm into it because, like I've already highlighted, you've been in the space for a while now. And I want you to just reflect on that journey. How has it been for you?
So as the bio said, I've been working on human rights over 20 years now, and it's been quite a fascinating journey. I was born in Malawi, and I often say this story because it's so important to my development as a human rights activist, as someone who pushes for democracy and the promotion and protection of human rights. So I was born into a one-party state that was ruled by one man, Dr. Banda, for 30 years. And I came of age at a time when Malawians were agitating for change, when Malawians were pushing for multi-party democracy and political freedoms, civil liberties. And it was, quite an eye-opening time for me as a young student who had arrived at the University of Malawi in her first year, at a university where political discourse was banned. Critical thinking in many ways was banned because critical thinking meant you would question the political dispensation that existed in the country at that time, where a lot of lecturers had either left, fled into exile, or been arrested for speaking their minds, for questioning, for speaking about political science. And so it was an eye-opener for me that despite this widespread censorship and the fear that permeated the country, students, Malawian citizens, still spoke out. The church played a fundamental role in pushing for democratic freedoms. And all that led to Malawi holding its first multi-party elections in 1994. And so that was the beginning of my journey. When I left university, I went to study for my master's in Amsterdam, a country that once again opened my eyes, a country that was really free, had all the liberties that you can think of. Most importantly for me was one that promoted women's freedoms, in particular, women's rights, that was at the forefront in terms of discussions around sexual and reproductive rights, as an example. So again, I learned quite a bit during my 2 years studying for my master's when I was in Amsterdam. The focus was mainly European women's rights, but that pushed me to start trying to look into, I know that there's African feminist thinking, and let me start reading a bit more about that as well. So that pushed me into that direction. And by the time I arrived in the United Kingdom, ostensibly I was supposed to study for my PhD. Things had, completely changed. I applied for my first job at Amnesty International as a campaigner, was lucky enough to be hired, and never looked back. And here I am now in my current position.
I think it's great inspiration for a lot of us young people. And you know how we consistently talk about how our countries in the southern region and the continent as a whole, the largest demographic is young people. So just being able to see how you're tracing your journey to when you were young and then looking back at what has happened, the change that has happened in your personal life, but also in the work that you're doing. But like we already said to our listeners earlier, that today we're focusing on unpacking the 2023 Freedom in the World report. So I'm just going to ask Tiseke to unpack what it is for the benefit of those that may not necessarily know what it is. So please, Tiseke, jump in, let us know what the report is. And I also understand that it's been running for a good number of years now. So it'll be great to also kind of reflect on that journey as well.
Thanks, Mantate. Yes, we're actually quite excited about our Freedom in the World report this year because it marks 50 years since we've been releasing this report. The Freedom in the World report is an annual assessment of political rights and civil liberties throughout the globe. Currently, for the 2023 report, we are covering 195 countries and 15 territories. The indicators and measurements are along two lines, as I said, civil liberties and political rights. When you're looking at civil liberties, I mean the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of belief, rule of law, personal autonomy, and individual rights. When I talk about political rights, I'm talking about the functioning of government, I'm talking about electoral processes, and I'm talking about political pluralism. So we look at both these very fundamental areas, and then we make a score. We score countries on average in terms of the overall score, looking at all these indicators. I think for the for most countries, they fall under the partly free designation. And then when we look at other countries, many fall under the free designation and others fall under the not free designation. So when we're saying you're not free, we're talking about this country is not free because it curtails people's civil liberties and its political rights are not always, people's political rights are not always respected. Those that are partly free are doing well in some measures, but not doing well in other measures. One really top line highlight that I want to give to you after 50 years of doing this report is that for the past 17 years, our findings have shown that democracy has been in decline. And that is something that has been of a huge concern. Even in those countries that we have in the past designated as being free, we have seen significant declines. And in certain cases, we have seen countries falling from being free to being partly free, and many countries falling from being partly free to not free. And so this has been a huge concern for us, and we can unpack as we discuss why we're seeing these democratic reversals, especially over the past 17 years.
Thank you so much for that overview. I think it's very clear, actually. And my next question was going to center around that, to say what has been the key findings from the 2023 report.
So when you look at the 2023 report, some of the biggest highlights are the decline, as I said, the consecutive decline, 17 years of consecutive decline when it comes to democratic freedoms, which mainly in 2023 were compounded by new coups that took place from Burkina Faso and other attempted coups that we also saw taking place in Tunisia, attempts to undermine representative governments in Peru and Brazil, and of course the impact of the effects of previous coups that we documented in previous reports, and ongoing repression and the ongoing closure of civic space in many countries, which led to some countries falling out of the partly free designation into the not free designation, or from the free designation into the partly free. And the two examples of countries that fell from being partly free to not free are Burkina Faso and Peru. The second, I think, major finding, and again, when you look at all the years that we've been reporting on civil liberties and political rights, essentially is that the struggle for democracy may actually be reaching a turning point. So yes, we've seen 17 years of decline, but at the same time, for the first time, we're seeing that those, over the past 17 years, the gap between those countries that showed an improvement in their score and those that declined has narrowed. So this year we saw 34 countries showing an improvement in the score and 35 countries declining. This is the narrowest gap that we've seen since we started reporting in 1973. What does that actually mean? It actually means that despite these reversals, we're seeing that there's a few more improvements when it comes to civil liberties and political rights across the globe. That we're now seeing a pushback that may be starting to kind of reverse the decline, maybe pointing towards a general improvement in democracy and human rights across the globe. And the final, I think, highlight that I really wanted to point to, which is closely related to this previous highlight, is the fact that I think the fight for freedoms is really persisting, continues. When you look at the movements that exist today, civil society organizations, and all those who have contributed, who continue to contribute to the fight for democracy and human rights, it has led to the further consolidation of democracies around the world that are now also, some of which have actually emerged from deeply repressed environments, where you could never have imagined that democracy could bear fruit. In the 50 years, one of the biggest examples, of course, is a country such as South Africa, which emerged from apartheid. What this tells us is that it is indeed possible that democracy is remarkably resilient, and even when at its greatest moments of challenge, there's always hope that things can improve. And that is down to the brave human rights defenders and civil society activists that we see across the globe, working daily to push back against democratic reversals.
Thank you so much. I actually like what you say, like just that reminder that, you know, part of the struggle for freedom is actually built on the victories that we've seen ourselves attain, motivating us to keep fighting so that we're able to see the change we want to see. I actually wanted to ask, because I think some of the countries that you gave an example of are not necessarily in Southern Africa. And my question really is around, does the report itself center on the region, like does it spotlight Southern Africa as a region, or it embeds it in the broader overview of the context of the continent and the world?
It certainly spotlights Africa. We have been covering Africa as part of the Freedom in the World report for just as long as we've covered the rest of the globe. And so certainly one can see trends both from the African perspective, but also from the regional perspective, whether it's in West Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, or the Horn. In Southern Africa, a lot of the trends that we have seen and that we recorded in 2023 align quite closely with what's happening across the rest of the continent. But I think the best thing for me would be to start at the continental level and then kind of drill down a little bit to what we're seeing at the regional level in Southern Africa. I think the first kind of highlight, again, we talk about backsliding, we'll also talk about improvements because it's not always bad. And certainly I think Africa this year showed some of the most dramatic improvements and some of the most drastic declines on the globe for various reasons. The first one is coups. Now, I have to kind of place a caveat that, you know, despite coups getting so much coverage, the number of coups across Africa has actually decreased, you know, from when we used to have coups in the 80s and 90s. So there has been a significant decrease between the 80s and 90s. What really concerned us over the past 5 years is that we were seeing a rising number of coups, you know, and we are really hoping that we do not see this blowout of coups that we saw in the 80s and 90s, which essentially, you know, created so many problems in many parts of the region, in particular West Africa. But this means that the coups that we saw, for example, the coup in Burkina Faso, 2 coups that took place in Burkina Faso in 2022 led to Burkina Faso being designated as not free and falling from being a country that's partly free. The results of other coups on the continent, Sudan, Chad, attempted coups in Tunisia, in places like Guinea, the effects of those coups, insecurity, wide insecurity, instability, violence, continued into 2022. Of interest to Southern Africa in particular is the fact that we saw continued repression and the continued closure of civic space. We saw African governments in particular making concerted attempts in terms of putting in place political systems that entrenched long-standing rule and long-standing authoritarian regimes. A good example of this is what we saw what we've seen in Swaziland, for example. We also saw political systems that entrenched one party into power, that led to increasing repression, increasing arrests, detentions of the opposition, of civil society actors, of government critics, attempts to clamp down on the independent media and media freedoms. This happened throughout the continent, but for Southern Africa, we saw this from Zimbabwe to Swaziland to Mozambique to Angola ahead of the elections that took place last year. Angola, in particular, saw a decline of 2 points in terms of political freedoms. It's already designated not free, but it declined by 2 points because of the arrest of civil society activists ahead of the elections, attacks on labor workers in that country. So there was a lot that happened. I want to also spotlight one country in Southern Africa, which is one of the few that is free. Of the countries that we cover in Africa, only 9 are actually designated as free, and one of them is South Africa. But in South Africa, we saw a country that was marred in terms of the previous year that we reported on, marked by, deeply entrenched corruption and corruption scandals that even implicated the president himself. We saw increasing levels of unemployment. We saw growing inequalities and a basic failure on the part of the government to deliver on social services, on the rights such as health and water and food security and housing. All of this, I think, points to a country that is in economic and political decline, and where we have serious concerns about democracy, despite the fact that it has very strong institutions that place a check on government. But as we go into the elections next year in South Africa, we are concerned by the decline in the political sphere and in civil liberties, which could point towards a democratic reversal. I've mentioned already Zimbabwe, that is going into elections next year. Zimbabwe remained designated as being only partly free. In fact, I think it had moved to being partly free, which continues to have significant problems. We have political activists that have remained in jail without charge for months and months, going into years now. We see ongoing attacks on government critics, on the opposition, and clampdowns on the opposition's ability to meet, which does not bode well for the elections that are coming up. So Southern Africa does paint a grim picture, but Bantate, I'm waiting for you to ask the positive question now, say what's going well.
Actually, I was about to get there, because I think, like, you gave an example, looking at Africa, for instance, where you're like 9 countries are actually in the free zone, and giving an example of South Africa as well. My question was going to be, before we look at the improvements highlighted in the 2023 report, my question is around what are some of the ways that these 9 countries kind of transitioned into that space of freedom? What are some of the things maybe that we've done that could be a lesson for the other countries on how they can transition from being partially or not free at all?
Great question. Yes, so when we're looking at countries and when we're designating them as free, what have these countries done to be free? First of all, they must have, strong institutions. When I talk about strong institutions, I talk about an independent judiciary, a free press, a vibrant civil society, strong, active civil society. We have to talk about the rule of law, equality for all, non-discrimination, non-marginalization, inclusivity, the ability of citizens to be able to access justice where it's required, making sure that people's rights are protected. The third element is around corruption. Corruption has been seen to be a huge impediment on democracy and democratic freedoms across the world. Beating corruption is a big one, which is why I spoke about what's happening in South Africa and our concerns there. Ending corruption should be key. Pushing for transparency and accountability on the parts of governments in how they manage resources. and how they distribute those resources is very important. The fourth one, I think, is adherence to regional and international human rights standards. We see a lot of governments having signed up to these standards fail to actually adhere to them. And that failure impedes democracy and the protection of human rights. A big one is strengthening electoral processes. And if you notice, we speak a lot about elections in our report because they are the cornerstone of democracy. They're not the only thing, but they're certainly a cornerstone of democracy. Well-run elections that are free and fair and are transparent are crucial for democracy across the globe, on the continent, and in Southern Africa. We need to see independent electoral bodies. We need to see functioning electoral systems and a strong legal framework for the holding of elections on our continent in Southern Africa. The list is long, but these are just some ways where if we saw governments push the needle in terms of improving some of in these areas, then we would certainly see democracy beginning to flourish and human rights being protected.
Thank you so much. I like the fact that we actually have countries on the continent, but also out there in the world where we can actually learn, seeing them transition from being partially free, not free, to a better status is a reminder that we can actually do it. We need to be able to do it. I will come back to ask you a little bit about potentially the interaction of the government with the report itself, because that's another key factor to how do you prove. You need to prove from a place of understanding this is the status quo. But like you said, we want to talk about the good things as well. So I really would love to hear some of the improvements that we have seen. And maybe as you speak on that, maybe highlighting a little bit on how do we preserve the progress that these improvements reflect and how do we build on those?
So I think this year we saw some interesting improvements, and I'll speak to Southern Africa in this case because you can compare and contrast so many developments in the region. So one of the most interesting things, I already spoke about electoral processes being so important, political pluralism being another key issue. In Lesotho, we had an election, and for the first time, we saw a changing of the old guard who had dominated the politics of Lesotho for decades, losing a freely held election, a free and fair election, to someone from a new party, Sam Matekane. It was a peaceful transfer of power, which is key, but it also showed that the opposition had the space to run for an election and to actually win it, and that the incumbent could step down. Now, Lesotho has a lot of problems, ongoing problems. I don't think this particular election has necessarily completely solved all of Lesotho's problems, such as security, for example, and what's happening around issues of corruption. But it certainly placed a spotlight on how a country can move and can improve, and end up at a stage where people actually have hope that elections actually mean change, which we have not seen in the past in other countries. Another example that I'll give in terms of the ripple effect of elections when they are run well and when they are free and fair and transparent is Zambia, where the 2021 elections that led to the leadership of Hakainde Hichilema, where we're starting to see some fruits being born from these elections and those election results, such as the implementation of anti-corruption initiatives, increased transparency, and a general opening up and a general great increase in respect for fundamental freedoms in that country. And so those are the two areas. So when we were reporting on what was happening in Zambia this year, these are the reports that came out. And we tied them back to the elections that took place in 2021. So for our 2022 report, we saw an improvement in these particular areas in a country such as Zambia. So elections, well run, mean something. Political pluralism means something. And just to set it in context, Mantante, why these improvements are so important, let me tell you this. Only 16 countries of the African countries that we report on, 6 of those countries, 16 scored 0 on the marker for political pluralism. What does that mean? It means a lot of them do not provide the space for the political opposition. And we have an example of such a country here in Southern Africa, Swaziland. So the difference is quite marked, and we have to speak to that improvement. I think another improvement, something that's been ongoing, is just, again, the sheer engagement of younger people, young people's participation in not just elections, but in democratic processes in general. And this is something that we have seen across the continent, that where young people are more engaged, we see election results that are actually reflective of the environment, but also we see changes. The innovation that we've seen through the use of technology. On the other hand, we say that governments have increasingly clamped down and put in resources to censor online freedoms, to prevent people from speaking out online. On the other hand, we have seen greater innovations in how people are able to access information, share that information, but also increase their engagement in democratic and political processes. And this one is outside of Southern Africa, but we saw that in Nigeria, although interestingly enough in Nigeria, which shows how complex this all is, even when we do these calls, that did not reflect on the ground when it came to election day, where there was a significant voter apathy and a very low number of people coming out to vote. So I've put it in a very complicated way, but that's because it is complex. Democracy is complex. You know, on one hand, you see something move forward. On the other hand, there's a bit of regression.
Thank you so much. As a young person, I was very excited when you started talking about the issue of youth participation, because like I said earlier, that we are a very large population in the continent in Southern Africa. And it's very important for us to participate, especially in elections, like you already said, it's the cornerstone of democracy. And I have so many questions, so I'll try and just bring them in slowly. The first one is around technology. And I have to agree with you that even myself as a young person, just looking at the last 5 years or so in my country, Zimbabwe, I've really seen young people become more interested online. I've seen more young people that were never talking about politics, actually talking about politics and elections on Twitter. But the question that I've always had is, are we likely to see that translating to youth voter turnout in Zimbabwe's 2023 elections? And you gave a very good example of Nigeria, where there was a lot online that gave so much hope. And then when that doesn't translate necessarily to mirror what's happening online on the ground, I think it does also affect young people's view of elections, their hope, and the idea of, does my participation actually matter? So I wanted for you to just reflect on that as well, to say, looking at Nigeria and so many other African countries are going to be having elections this year, what are some of the things that we need to learn about the optimization of potentially digital technology as a space for engagement and reflection, but also being able to take that offline to us showing up in some way to vote and be involved?
So, you know, this again is a bit of a complex question, because I don't think there's an easy answer, short-term answer to this. I think the long-term answer here, and it's, again, I like to place things in a broader context. Civic education, civic awareness is something that is key. And we have seen this in places from the United States to Europe, Asia, and the continent, where the longer-term civic engagement of young people is very, very important, so that they can understand how government functions, how their local government functions, whether it's at municipal level, national level, how this all fits in together, where they need to have their voices heard, who they need to speak to, and why. And I say this because what technology has done is that it has widened the platform in many ways. It has provided the space. But who are the young people engaging on those technological platforms? They may be having great debates on the issues of the day and the social issues that affect their lives. But who is being engaged in that platform? And so what I see is that there's this disconnection between the discourse, which I think is excellent, that is taking place on social media platforms, and what's actually happening on the ground. That's the first thing, which then prevents or leads to young people not necessarily bringing what they're saying on technological platforms to the actual voting booth. The second thing is, I think young people are not homogeneous. They come from different backgrounds. One of the biggest things we spoke about was unemployment levels. Unemployment levels for young people are particularly high. A young person, therefore, maybe is not able to afford to even go to a voting booth, to a voting station and vote. May not be able to leave their home, or they may have other priorities that they're focused on. And so this is, I think, part of a much bigger issue for society in general, in terms of how are we working as a society to enable young people to be more involved in these platforms? And then putting the onus also back on young people to be more engaged beyond social media, to physically get out there, raise awareness, form their own political parties, form their own activist parties, whether around various issues that affect them. Start figuring out how they can petition governments, petition local authorities on issues that affect them. So it's that kind of civic activism that I think is there online, but is not there on the ground. And then we need to provide young people with the resources that allow them to actually do what we're talking about, allow them to get out there, allow them to volunteer. We can't do that in situations where young people are struggling, young graduates are struggling to find a job. So we are faced with this multiplicity of challenges, but these huge, really significant opportunities as well. And there's no easy answer.
Thank you so much. I love that, your recommendations, especially where young people are concerned, are very practical, because it's just the big question of, I'm trying to hustle for that dollar that will take me through today. How do you expect me to spend an entire day queuing somewhere trying to register to vote? So I think it's very important that we begin to think about how do we solve the everyday challenges of young people while also encouraging them to actually take that responsibility to vote and be a part of governance processes broadly. I wanted to ask you, I think we've spoken a lot around young people. Is there any specific reflection around women as well?
Certainly, I think a lot of the work that we do at Freedom House focuses on people who are traditionally marginalized, whose voices are not often heard. Unfortunately, 50% of the population, which is women, is among those. And so here on this continent, a big issue for us has been around online gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is a scourge, and it's a scourge that has not yet been addressed. But even more worryingly, when it comes to women's participation in politics, what we're also seeing is increasing incidents of online gender-based violence. Here in Southern Africa, Freedom House has worked in partnership with organizations such as Gender Links and People Opposing Women Abuse and others to start documenting, the Center for Human Rights, start documenting, online gender-based violence against women in general, online gender-based violence against women politicians. And there are multiple examples. We've seen the way Fadzai Mahere, who's the spokesperson for CCC, is constantly attacked online when she speaks out in Zimbabwe. We see there's numerous examples. And this type of violence prevents women from actually participating. So one of the biggest drives is for governments to start legislating against online gender-based violence and punishing those who actually participate in such actions. We're a long way from doing that. Another thing, and this is something that these are the effects that started around the pandemic, and we've seen the continued impact of the pandemic on women who are in the informal economy, who are the bulk of women in the workforce in Southern Africa. Just because it's the informal economy, it is often ignored as being a significant part of the workforce. The pandemic had a huge impact. It prevented women from going out and selling their wares. They were then trapped in homes, which were sometimes violent. And the decline in the economies of a lot of countries as a result of the pandemic has pushed women further into poverty. And I think that's a big, big concern. And so that has also had an effect on their ability to exercise their democratic rights. We often, don't talk about how all these things are connected and how when we see these types of situations, it's women that suffer the most. And I finally want to talk about women in conflict because even though that's not highlighted in our 2023 report, we have seen a breakout of violence, of hostilities in Sudan between two warring forces, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese army, which has led to widespread displacement. People fleeing, thousands and thousands of people fleeing across the borders into Egypt, into Chad, into other neighboring countries, being internally displaced in the country. And again, the bulk of those who feel the greatest impact of this type of war, of conflict, is women. So, it's something that we should really be doing much better when it comes to how, women are treated on our continent globally. I won't even go into the whole issue of sexual and reproductive rights and the pushback against that in the United States, for example, where we thought things had changed. But I'll stop there because we could go into a whole lot of different conversations around women's rights and how I see them.
Thank you so much for that, Tiseke. I wanted to actually ask you, because I think we've spoken very well about Africa and also extensively about Southern Africa. My interest is in understanding how the status of freedom in different parts of the world interact. What's happening in Asia, for instance, or in Europe, when like the status of human rights in different regions, how does that interact particularly with the Southern region or just Africa? How do the regions interact based on just the observations that you're seeing through the reports?
One of the good things that this report highlights is how interconnected the world is, and how what is happening in one part of the world actually has an effect on another part of the world. One of those things that Freedom in the World covers and has been covering for the past couple of years now, I think we're going into year 2, is the Ukraine war and the effects of the Ukraine war. Not just because Russia, went in and declared war in a sovereign country, but the effects of that war on food security in Africa, and how African governments have borne the economic and food impacts, food insecurity impacts of the war between Russia and Ukraine, because they've been unable to import grain into Africa. We've been unable to import grain from the Ukraine, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is how the multiplicity of actors that we've seen. I've spoken about coups in the Sahel region and the interference of state and non-state actors in other parts of the world. And I'll give 2 examples. One is the Sahel, where we have seen various, actors and militant actors and mercenaries coming from other parts of the world. So, for example, we've seen the presence that's been reported of mercenaries from the Wagner Group, which is a Russian group in the Central African Republic, in Chad. We've also seen the presence of French forces in places such as Central African Republic, Mali, and Burkina Faso, although I think they've withdrawn their forces. All these interactions don't often bode well for the citizens on the ground, because these interactions are designed from political and economic interests. A country like Central African Republic has a lot of resources, and one can only imagine that all these various political actors are in there fighting amongst each other because of the resources that can be found in the Central African Republic. And this is compounded by weak governments. So the governments in these regions are very weak and are unable to deal with issues of security by themselves, and therefore that has led to interference on the part of other actors from out of that country. Another good example of this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as we speak, continues to see a conflict in the eastern part, where there are various non-state and state actors present. We have the M23, we have the Congolese government, we have the United Nations peacekeeping force, we have an East African force, and we have the Angolan army, all in this country. all fighting it out. Whether it is to the benefit of citizens is highly, highly questionable. So these are the kind of the negative impacts that we see when you talk about some of these global connections. We should also speak about global precedents. When countries start to introduce negative laws, for example, a lot of the laws that have come about around cybersecurity, which have been designed mainly to clamp down on online activism. We see one government introducing the law. For example, we saw Lesotho attempting to introduce that law. We saw Swaziland attempting to introduce a similar law. We saw Zimbabwe doing the same. Some of these laws are also copied and pasted from outside of the region. Anti-NGO laws, for example, some of them come from Russia, and governments have copied and pasted those anti-NGO laws and taken them as their own. So the world is interconnected in very negative ways, but it's also interconnected in very positive ways. I think technology allows sharing of knowledge and ideas amongst activists. It increases the potential for advocacy for change globally. You saw what happened with George Floyd. Everyone realized that this was a moment to come together and to protest against racism. And we saw the protests coming from America all the way to here in Africa. A big thing that we need to be looking out for, and which way we can take advantage of this interconnectedness is climate change, which is looming over us and is fast becoming, a big problem. And it's only through governments coming together and coming up with strong recommendations about how they can address climate change that we can actually move the needle. Africa is key to those discussions, even though we are not the biggest emitter of pollutants. But we are key to a discussion because we are feeling the effects of climate change through droughts, an increase in the numbers of floods, running out of resources such as water. We are bearing the brunt of climate change and the actions of governments elsewhere. So there's a lot. I can go on and on again. I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much. I was just actually thinking that there's just so much that you're raising, which gives us a lot of content for future conversations with different people as well, which is actually great. So I would have asked you like what can be done, but I think you've done a great job of highlighting some of the challenges we see, but also what must be done. My earlier question was around how you've seen governments react to the reports each year that you've published them, and also maybe reflecting on the 2023 one to say, how do governments respond, both in the countries that are free, but also those ones that are not necessarily free?
So because our report is read widely, so it's read by governments, it's read by policymakers and other entities, it garners a lot of interest, academics, civil society. And yes, certainly we have governments that constantly engage with us on the findings of the report, very cordially reaching out to us and asking, what we have a problem with this indicator, this assessment, and we engage in a very robust exchange. So we are always open to receiving feedback on the report. We're quite clear about the methodology related to the report. There will always be some that fundamentally disagree with our findings, and that's not a surprise. But for the most part, we get people and governments that want to engage on the findings and often ask us, so what should we do to improve our scores in the next year or 2 or 3? And we often tell them that it's not an immediate thing, it's a cumulative thing, yes? The scores may improve, but they improve cumulatively, right? Over a number of years. So it's certainly a report that brings about a lot of robust conversation and engagement between us and governments.
I love that so much because I think reports like that do not necessarily exist to attack anyone. It's reminding us of where we are and where we need to be. And I think also just being able to see the different levels that these countries are at, it's a good reflection to say if someone else is doing it and they're in the same continent or region as you are at, there's just so much room for us to also improve. And obviously our listeners are different people. It's ordinary people, it's civil society, people in government, different spaces. I would want for you to maybe just give a reflection on what, the ordinary person listening to this, show today can actually do, not just to raise awareness, but also to begin to better understand the value of democratic freedom and how they can be able to do something and how.
I think the best thing any one of us as ordinary citizens can do is continue to hold our governments accountable through the systems that we know, whether, as I said, it could be at village level. Hold your government accountable, hold the chief accountable, hold the member of parliament in your constituency accountable. When he comes to your constituency, before he trying to parcel out or buy votes, question him and ask him, why should I vote for you? You know, what have you done? That culture of questioning and holding the duty bearers accountable is what's going to bring change in our communities, in our societies, and in our countries.
We could definitely go on because there's just so much to talk about, so much to share. But I will have to obviously bring the conversation to an end. And I think just first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this conversation today. Like I already said, your work is inspiring. And I think the report itself is inspiring because it's just reminding us, it's keeping us in check in the different regions, different countries that we're coming from. So we appreciate you being a part of this conversation today. I'm also hoping that, you know, our listeners will definitely look you up, check out your work and see what you're going to be up to. And also just a special thank you to our listeners as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the issues that have been raised on today's show, but we also recommend that you read the 2023 Freedom in the World report that Tiseke has so expertly unpacked for us. You can also follow the Southern Defenders social media accounts on Twitter or on Facebook. We'll definitely share them with you guys when we post this across our social media as well. Take us in the reflections that you're going to share. We'll be happy for you to also just share this podcast so that those other people that don't have access to our different accounts can actually be a part of the discourse and continue the conversation. You can also visit the Southern Defenders website on www.southerndefenders.africa, and you can subscribe to the homepage to get updates on the upcoming podcast episodes, but as well as to catch on previous ones and to read on the work of the Southern Defenders. So this is the Civic Space Today program of the Southern Defenders. I am Mandatum Lojwa, your host on today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and see you next time. Together we defend.